Merci. Thank you, Stefan. Thank you very much indeed to Araf for inviting me this morning. Incentive regulation is a great topic for today, and I hope that we can share with you some of the experience that we have from the UK, and I hope that this will be helpful for the debate and development of the framework in France. I'm going to cover a few things. First of all, an outline of what ORR is and what we do, how we work. Secondly, I'm going to say a few things about the way we have gone about our periodic review process and the way that sets up the framework of incentives. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about a few of the key incentives that we operate with. So, ORR, firstly. As you'll be aware, the railways in Britain were vertically separated at the point of privatisation in the early 90s, and the ORR was set up initially as the economic regulator for infrastructure. We currently regulate the two infrastructure operators, Network Rail and High Speed 1 Limited. We are now an integrated economic and safety regulator, and for safety we cover the whole of the industry. We also cover the whole of the rail industry for as the competition authority and the consumer authority, and this includes national infrastructure, the train operators, tramways, the underground metros, and even heritage railways, which gives us some interesting problems. Most of what I'm going to say this morning relates to the way we regulate Network Rail. Much of it also applies to the way we regulate HS1. It's also probably just worth saying that in addition to the examples of public sector entities being regulated that Martin talked about just now, Network Rail itself is about to become another one because it is being reclassified and it's returning to the public sector from September. Nevertheless, we believe that the commercial pressures that the business will face in the public sector nevertheless mean that the incentives I'm going to discuss still apply just as strongly as they do now. So the main aim of the incentive framework in Britain is to ensure that the incentives facing the different parts of the industry are coherent and they're aligned in the interests of the railways customers and its funders, so that they encourage efficient behaviour and better performance from the infrastructure manager and train operators. The periodic review, which I'll talk about now for a few minutes, is the process through which every 5 years we determine the outputs that Network Rail must deliver, the efficient costs of delivering those outputs, and the income which the company will receive from train operators and other funders using the network. It also establishes the wider regulatory framework which applies for the whole industry, including the incentives that act on the infrastructure manager, the train operators, and others in the industry to deliver and outperform the output and efficiency targets that we set. As economic regulator, one of our principal tasks is to determine what the infrastructure manager must achieve within the 5-year period covered by each periodic review. I won't talk about this in detail, but the point of this slide is really to illustrate the very constructive, consultative and iterative process involving contributions, very substantial contributions from the industry on the top, and some statements from government, and ORR as the regulator on the bottom, through the periodic review process, which typically lasts around 2.5 years from start to finish. The process is initiated by the ORR, but the first step is, the first sort of substantive step is an industry-led one. Responding to what Martin said earlier, actually quite a lot of the suggestions on what the industry should be delivering and what it can achieve over each 5-year period come from the industry itself. So in this process, the initial industry plan is one in which the businesses across the sector set out proposals and options for the development of the network. And then using this plan, the governments and advice from the initial advice from the ORR, the governments in London and Edinburgh then set out their desired outputs in their high-level output specifications. These cover things like sort of key outputs for end users, like the proportion of trains that they expect to run on time through the period, extra capacity into urban centres, extra capacity for freight, and also particular route enhancements such as journey time improvements and the extent and scope of electrification. Once the governments have decided what they want and how much money is available, the industry, led by Network Rail, then produces a plan setting out how it intends to deliver those required outputs and what they think it will cost. So ORR then reviews this plan in great detail. We determine whether the high-level output specifications of the governments are affordable given the public funds that they've said they want to make available, and taking into account industry revenues and costs. So this means that the ORR works out how much money the infrastructure manager needs to deliver the outputs, and how efficient it needs to be in order to achieve that. And, of course, because Network Rail is a monopoly, we look very, very critically at whether its plans are efficient. Once we've done this, we then formally set out the outputs and funding requirements, as well as challenging efficiency targets, bearing in mind our duty not to make it unduly difficult for Network Rail to finance its activity. So there is some reasonable constraint on the speed and extent of the efficiency challenge that we can set them. So for the periodic review that we completed last year, and is just coming into effect for the 5-year period that started in April this year, ORR set an efficiency improvement target for Network Rail of 19.5% over the 5-year period, compared with the 13% that the company initially assumed. So we aim to give Network Rail a challenging outcome to replicate the sort of challenges that businesses would face to perform and deliver under competition. We give them, in return for challenging targets, a huge amount of flexibility on how to deliver, avoiding sort of detailed second-guessing and micromanagement in areas where the company should have the expertise to make the best judgments, and we certainly don't assume that all of the best information and the best judgments can be made by the regulator on how to deliver. The overall impact of our framework and incentives over the last decade, which is shown in this slide, has been to reduce the day-to-day costs on a sort of like-for-like basis of Britain's rail industry by around 40%. Those are the sort of red bars you can see coming down in the middle of the slide. And on the basis, as I said, of our latest periodic review, we expect those like-for-like costs to come down by another 19% in the next 5 years, and we expect that this will close the gap using the benchmarking that we have available with the most efficient in Europe, and as this chart shows, also freeing up funds to invest in a bigger and better and safer network. And this chart just illustrates the effect of this in terms of the additional investment that greater efficiency has made possible. So this is the rise in Network Rail's spending and investment on enhancements to the capacity and quality of the network over the last decade. Now, we're constantly challenging and encouraging the industry to work together to improve productivity and reduce costs and deliver better value for money for customers. We're doing this by strengthening and developing incentives to align better the incentives that Network Rail faces with those of its customers and the train operators, and to make sure that Network Rail is over time becomes more commercially responsive to the needs of its customers. So, turning now to incentives. Our system combines a series of incentives set out here, so contractual incentives, financial incentives, reputational incentives, and sort of administrative incentives through things like earned autonomy. And I'll just talk through a few of those in a bit more detail so you can see what the key incentives to perform in the system are. It's worth noting that the contractual and some of the financial incentives I'm going to describe are put in place through the changes that we make every 5 years in the periodic review process to the framework agreements between Network Rail and each of the train operators that operate on its track. And that's one of the reasons that all of these parties see those framework agreements as key parts of the regulatory landscape, but also of their commercial landscape. So it really matters to them. Let me say a bit first about contractual incentives. Firstly, the main contractual incentives are the possessions regime and the performance regime, both based on effectively constituting a liquidated damages regime. The possessions regime, first of all, is the part of the framework through which compensation is paid to train operators when they are unable to use parts of the network because of planned restrictions on use, such as those they need to carry out engineering or construction works. So in planning its engineering work, Network Rail is incentivized to take account of the financial impact on operators caused by engineering-related disruption, and to develop efficient engineering access plans so that it doesn't incur additional costs beyond the efficient level for which it's funded. It can also keep costs to a minimum by advising operators of forthcoming engineering works well in advance so that they can plan and make adjustments to their operations and inform passengers. So that can minimise disruption as far as possible, and where they can do that, they receive a discount for doing so. The performance regime is the part of the framework through which the infrastructure manager and train operators either pay compensation for poor performance on the network or receive incentive payments for good performance. The rail industry in Britain operates a scheme which encourages both Network Rail and the train operators to improve their performance by reducing average minutes of lateness and by reducing cancellations. Details of the regime are incorporated into the track access charges for each operator. And this performance regime sets out which compensation is paid by either party if train or network performance fails to meet set benchmarks, which are set out in line with the regulated outputs that we set. Let's say a few things about financial incentives now. We've introduced several financial incentives. We start from the principle that if Network Rail's income is set at a level which is equal to its costs, and since it doesn't face competition, it has limited incentives to improve its productivity and control those costs. We've therefore developed incentives to align the interests of Network Rail and its customers to make Network Rail more commercially responsive to their needs. The financial incentives include a route-based efficiency, benefit sharing system, and a volume incentive. So first of all, the route level benefit sharing mechanism, this operates at the route level within Network Rail. So effectively there is a different mechanism for each of the routes, the geographic units of Network Rail. And it encourages Network Rail at a route level to work with the operators on each route to work together and allows the operators to share in any upside benefits in terms of gains or indeed losses that the infrastructure manager makes compared with its targets on an annual basis. We expect the network operators to work very closely with Network Rail, and if Network Rail's costs are lower than we assumed, then the operators will share in the savings, but if they are higher, then operators will pay part of the increase. Secondly, we have a volume incentive, which is paid to Network Rail for accommodating additional traffic on the network. The volume incentive is paid to Network Rail to encourage it to be more responsive to unexpected demand for the use of network capacity over and above an agreed level, the level set out in the periodic review. So the volume incentive is important because it acts as a counterbalance to the service reliability and punctuality targets which Network Rail faces and which may, if they were allowed to run by themselves, encourage Network Rail to limit access to the network to improve its chance of meeting those targets. So it places a value on the additional use of network capacity and so encourages Network Rail to consider the trade-off when deciding whether or not to meet unexpected demand from its customers. So far, we've talked about the contractual and financial incentives Network Rail, but there are others. One of our regulatory levers is Network Rail's licence, which we oversee and which we can enforce if necessary, including the use of sanctions in some cases. This gives rise to reputational incentives, both for the business and for its executive directors. So when we make decisions about, as part of the periodic review, we also decide on the outputs that Network Rail should deliver over the 5-year period. Once we've set these outputs, if Network Rail fails to deliver them, then we can investigate whether it's breached its network licence, and if so, what should be done to put that right. And depending on the seriousness of the breach, we can also impose a financial penalty. Both we and Network Rail attach enormous importance to the funding settlement and the regulatory outputs that go with it. It is, after all, fundamental to their long-term commercial and financial sustainability of their business, and therefore any failure to achieve those outputs is seen in some ways as a matter of sort of shame and loss of reputation for the company and its senior employees. So, I'll just say very briefly on the subject of earned autonomy. Where Network Rail appears to be at risk of not meeting its targets or is actually not meeting them, we will seek much greater detailed assurance from the company that it has plans to get back on track, and we monitor the situation much more closely. And this is something that, understandably, the company doesn't like and will put more effort into trying to restore service. We do not micromanage the business in these situations, but we do monitor more closely. And correspondingly, where Network Rail can get performance back on track and restore punctuality to the level that's been funded in our settlement, we will monitor them less closely. So there's an incentive there on the executives in the business to deliver in that sense. So just to summarise, actually, just briefly on this slide shows in the blue line how punctuality has improved over the last 5 years. So just to summarise, our general approach to the periodic review is firmly rooted in incentive regulation. This involves setting clear outputs for the regulated company and including financial rewards, not just for meeting, but for outperforming these outputs and outperforming our assessment of the efficient level of spending. Importantly, we don't decide how Network Rail should meet the periodic review requirements we set. That's their job. We encourage them to apply their expertise and their commercial judgment. Our role as regulator focuses not on specifying the detail of how Network Rail should deliver, but on output-based incentive regulation, with the company incentivised effectively to deliver and outperform outputs and efficiency targets, which are both stretching and achievable and meet the interests of its funders and its customers. Thank you very much.